All right, more on Karl Popper and his falsifiability nonsense. Okay, hopefully this will come out on this video, so I'm not going to use this backup because it looks like the quality's not good for some reason. Over here, there, it was on manual, now it's looking better, but still. It was manual white balance, the white balance wasn't looking good. Still, I'm looking here, and this doesn't capture the same thing, but gotta use a backup if I gotta use a backup. Whatever. So, turn this over. There is glare. Okay. Got a backup if I need it. So, one of the fun things about recording videos and doing this stuff. So, Popper, falsification, the falsity of falsification. So one thing that's backing him into a corner and giving him this problem, making him need to, ironically enough, do pseudoscience like he is trying to criticize. So his theory is pseudoscientific, so he's wanting to have like things to go in circles around the earth. And so in real astronomy, it appears that amongst the background of stars, it would appear that some planets, say Mars, will be going forward and then stops and goes back for a little bit and then goes forward in the stars again. So that's where planet comes from. It means, from what I've heard, moving or wandering star in ancient Greek, wandering with an A, not with an O. Wandering star. So there were stars in the heavens, and there were some that moved around. They were the wandering stars, the planets. And they got this thing of going backwards, backwards, retro. So retrograde motion. And Ptolemy, in a pseudoscientific way, not knowing how to do science yet, not knowing how concepts relate to reality and all that, kind of like Popper, he good at math, smart dude, probably nice and all that. I don't know, but didn't know some important things about how to really do science. Good at math, but he came up with a like pseudoscientific way, just like a mathematical calculation machine to figure out where things were, attempt to, without paying attention to the identity of things or what they really did, to think about this going backwards. Here's the Earth, here's Mars going around the Earth, and so there'd be a circle going around nothingness. So this Mars would be here, and it would be turning on this circle, which is going around here, and Mars would be going around. This would be at a different rate than this, and so sometimes, when you're here, this circle's turning, so the planet's going forward. And there'll come a time when, even though this circle is continuing to go around here, if it gets down here, it looks like it's going backwards against the background of stars. So, when it's going here, and this is going here, it's in the same direction. But if this circle is going along there still, but Mars is going there, since the rates are different, it's going to look like Mars is going backwards amongst the background stars. And that's the thing that Ptolemy did. So he kind of backed himself into a hole. And they'd have to have all these weird things and like little mechanisms built on little mechanisms to try to get around the discrepancy between reality. And Kepler, he came along, figured out how things really worked, and he called in his book, he titled it "A New Astronomy Based on Causes." You know, and that's what we need. Hume, Kant, Popper, they're still caught up in this, having mechanisms upon mechanisms, unable to figure out how induction works. Like, you know, I couldn't either. It's like pretty freaking difficult to figure out. Not even Aristotle did, as genius as he was. He was excellent at induction. He was a master. Man, he induced basic principles about metaphysics, the most fundamental. He induced abstract fundamental principles about epistemology, you know, identified syllogisms, identified what they all have in common, identified what made a valid form of, what made all reasoning valid, this broad generalization about everything that was so perfect and awesome, it even extended, since it was about thought, beyond what he knew like at the time. So he didn't know enough about induction or how it worked, but it's still, you know, law of non-contradiction, some things like that, they still pertain, of course, to that because they're knowledge. But this is kind of what Popper's doing, not getting into causes. So he's back into a corner since he wants to deny induction since he can't figure it out. And it's, you know, it's difficult, but he shouldn't be stomping his foot and saying, I can't figure it out, therefore it's not true. He should be saying, I don't know. You know, like Galileo said, if you don't know, say you don't know. It works. I don't know how, but it does. We got to figure it out more. I'm not smart enough to do it. Just admit it. But he backs himself into a corner. And then he gets this nonsense about falsification. So here, of course, stuff will be in the description field. Karl Popper, quote, or The Problem of Induction, unquote. From Karl Popper, The Logical Scientific Discovery, New York, Basic Books, 1959, page 27 to 34. This is on a University of Texas site somewhere. TAMUCC. Okay. The so-called problem of induction. So, digging into this falsification nonsense and seeing how Popper was forced there. Instead of being like Kepler and Galileo and Newton, he was a follower like of Ptolemy. So, quote, according to a widely accepted view, the empirical sciences can be characterized by the fact that they use inductive methods, as they are called. According to this view, the logic of scientific discovery would be identical with inductive logic, i.e., the logical analysis of these inductive methods. It is unusual to call an inference inductive. It is usual to call an inference inductive if it passes from singular statements, sometimes also called particular statements, such as accounts of the results of observations or experiments, to universal statements, such as hypotheses or theories. Now, it is far from obvious, from a logical point of view, that we are justified in inferring universal statements from singular ones, no matter how numerous. For any conclusion drawn in this way may always turn out to be false. No matter how many instances of white swans we have observed, this does not justify the conclusion that all swans are white, unquote. Amen. Because enumeration is not induction. False. So right there we have some ignorant or deliberate or confused statement on the part of Popper as to what induction is. Enumeration is not induction. There's no cause there. All swans are white. That's just enumeration. This, why? That's not any, there's no causal statement to that. If maybe there were a reason some swans were white, then it could become an induction, but it's just enumeration. You know, once we have, yeah, of course, if you just merely enumerate things, this person's immoral, this person's immoral, this person's immoral, this person's immoral, therefore all people are immoral. No, you know, because that's just an enumeration. There's no cause there. Why do they have to be that way. You know, people have free will, volition, and that obviates, would be the word, or precludes one from saying that by some enumeration, like all people are moral or something like that, which involves their chosen character. So, you know, all swans are white, you know, it's saying that that shows not all inductions are true is invalid because it's not even a proper induction, a proper generalization. So one thing, you know, if he was, I don't know, more informed, or if he had some better background stuff, you know, like the stuff I've thought of, knowing enumeration versus induction, I didn't think of it on my own, but stuff like that would help, you know, and all these people we've had through all the centuries, instead of like being silly, people should grasp that we generalize, it's part of our mental functioning, it works, and so we're just confused about how it works yet, instead of saying it doesn't work. It's like ludicrous. Besides, it's a generalization. All generalization is invalid? Well, prove it. Is there any evidence to it? Did you get it by logical conclusion from particular statements, or did you just make crap up? And in this case, they just made crap up. You know, if all induction is invalid, well, that is a generalization about inductions, so it's invalid. Or, you know, it could always turn out to be false. And as it says, think about it that way. Reword it. Now it is far from obvious, from a logical point of view, that we are justified in inferring universal statements from singular ones, no matter how numerous. For any conclusion drawn in this way may always turn out to be false. No matter how many instances of generalization we may have observed, this does not justify the conclusion that all generalizations are invalid. And, you know, for that, well, we'll get to that in a minute, but quote, the question whether inductive inferences are justified or under what conditions is known as the problem of induction. Okay. The question of whether emotion is justified and under what conditions is known as the problem of emotion. The question of whether digestion is justified or under what conditions is known as the problem of digestion. The question whether deductive inferences are justified or under what conditions is known as the problem of deduction. The question whether concept formation is justified or under what conditions is known as the problem of concept formation. The question whether driving is justified or under what conditions is known as the problem of driving. So what? Duh. You know, there's a so-called problem of everything for that way, but that doesn't mean it's invalid. There's a problem of deduction. I can't just do it automatically. Oh my gosh. I can't just digest automatically. Hello. So again, here, we need to be thinking about what's being said and if that principle applies to other things. We need to read and understand what someone says, take the word seriously, but process these in terms of other things we know. What does this apply to? What else? How could things be written differently? What else is there in logic? Is it all automatic? And the problem here is what is automatic and given and what is not? You know, as you can even see, deduction is not automatic either. If it were, once people learn some concept or a generalization, they could automatically apply it correctly, but people forget, they're mistaken, they lie, all these things. Deduction does not occur automatically. So there's a problem with it too. Observation, paying attention to details, does not occur automatically. There's a problem with observation. We need to train ourselves to observe what's relevant and what's not, and to pay attention to things in our survival. It's not some automatic thing, you know. So the question is, as I say, like, what is the given? What is automatic and what is not? That's the thing he needs to figure out. And, you know, the thing is, what can we change? What do we have control over? Some people have said in lectures I've listened to and things I've learned from, didn't think of this on my own, but, you know, perception, we can't help. It just happens. Things in the world impinge upon us. That's what's happening in perception. That's our connection to reality. Whether Kant makes up some nonsense to the contrary, or someone else, or they don't understand it. Facts are facts. When we look at it, what is actually the case, not what does someone misunderstand, and what do they complain about it? I don't understand, or I don't want it to be this way. Well, sorry, it is. But mental processes are under our control, so there's a problem with all of them, but not with perception and with identifying it on a basic first level. So, you know, this stuff he's trying to claim and get us to think about induction only applies to other things. So, quote, the problem of induction may be formulated as the question of how to establish the truth of universal statements, which are based on experience, such as the hypotheses and theoretical systems of the empirical sciences. For many people believe that the truth of these universal statements is known by experience. Yet it is clear that an account of an experience, of an observation, or the result of an experiment can, in the first place, be only a singular statement and not a universal one. Accordingly, people who say of a universal statement that we know is the truth from experience usually mean that the truth of this universal statement can somehow be reduced to the truth of singular ones, and that these singular ones are known by experience to be true, which amounts to saying that the universal statement is based on inductive inference. Thus, to ask whether there are natural laws known to be true appears to be only another way of asking whether inductive inferences are logically justified. Unquote. But yeah, once you've brought induction down step by step to experience, that's what it is to show it to be true. That's what logic is about. And here, Popper's missing out on some things, you know, that I didn't think of myself that have been brought to my attention. I learned from other people through the decades. A mistake is not getting what all involved is in the knowing part. Known by experience. Okay, experience, yeah, but known. There is a hell ton involved in that. You know, he'd have to dig into what is involved in mental processing. Known by experience, what cognitive processing, conceptual processing do we do to know this by experience? That's the thing that's being left out or ignored here. It's not, bam, we know things platonically by a sudden insight into experience. It's not just, if you say, light is a form of electromagnetic radiation that moves at 186,000 miles per second. That is not known by direct experience, period, straightforward. It is known by direct experience through a bunch of cognitive steps with a bunch of reasoning, induction, concept formation. So I think that's one thing he's missing out on. It's known by experience that way. And that's when we know it to be true. That is the standard. The thing where we don't have no choice, the given, the starting point. Experience, perception is the starting point to which everything must be submitted, like it or not. But because he's not getting some of this stuff, what's involved in the processing, what does knowing mean for a human? How does it relate to experience? These different things. Then he's backed into this corner, and since he's unable to figure out what induction is, as I couldn't either. Thankfully, I've learned from some other people, and I talk about some of that in some other videos and in podcast episodes and stuff. Now, quote, yet if we want to find a way of justifying inductive inferences, we must first of all try to establish a principle of induction. Unquote. Okay, yeah, and a principle of deduction. Experience is just what it is. There's no principle that justifies it because perception is the standard that justifies it all. You do not, there has to be a starting point in reason. You can't go on an infinite regress, start out of nowhere. There has to be something to know if we are to know. Knowledge is an awareness of reality. There has to be the reality to be aware of. And to have conceptual general knowledge, we got to have the particulars to generalize from. And he's not getting some of that, which, as I say, again and again and again, I wouldn't get on my own either. Quote, yet if we want to find a way of justifying inductive inferences, we must first of all try to establish a principle of induction. A principle of induction would be a statement with the help of which we could put inductive inferences into a logically acceptable form. In the eyes of upholders of inductive logic, a principle of induction is of supreme importance for scientific method. This principle, says Reichenbach, determines the truth of scientific theories. To eliminate it from science would mean nothing less than to deprive science of the power to decide the truth or falsity of its theories. Without it, clearly, science would no longer have the right to distinguish its theories from the fanciful and arbitrary creations of the poet's mind, unquote, unquote. Truth. Very true. Now, quote, now this principle of induction cannot be a purely logical truth, like a tautology or an analytic statement. Indeed, if there were such a thing as a purely logical principle of induction, there would be no problem of induction. Unquote. Huh? Okay, well, I'll continue it. Quote, for in this case, all inductive inferences would have to be regarded as purely logical or tautological transformations, just like inferences in deductive logic, unquote. Wrong. Not every deduction is valid. It's got to be true. There's rules of induction. There are syllogisms, for one thing. All dogs are mammals. All dogs have noses, or let's say all dogs bark. Therefore, all animals bark. That's an invalid deduction, but it is still some form of deduction. Same thing with induction here. There are valid deductions and valid inductions. Not every deduction is valid. Not every induction is valid. So this is like a non sequitur, a non-true, and he's just maybe talking some stuff and he didn't understand it, and so he's expecting maybe other people not to understand it too. And besides, that's one way to think about it. And then deduction is not merely a tautological transformation. There's content there. It's not purely logical. A proper deduction gives us some new insight. It is not always obvious. You can even say that to some people. Bring into play a generalization on a particular instance that they didn't think of bringing it into play, and they'll go, oh, snap, like light bulb. If it was purely logical or tautological, that wouldn't happen. There's content, there's connections, there's things going on cognitively. So wrong. That purely logical or tautological nonsense is nonsense. There's something material in it, and that's where we get it from in the first place. Quote, thus the principle of induction must be a synthetic statement, that is, a statement whose negation is not self-contradictory but logically possible. So the question arises why such a principle should be accepted at all, and how we can justify its acceptance on rational grounds. Unquote. Now, goes through some more here. And here, again, he's not getting what logic is. Logic was developed to connect our concepts to reality because it was known that, and we know today, that people can argue. They need rules for argument. Aristotle helped figure out some of that for deduction. But people had to figure out what the standard is. What's the given? What can we all agree on? What is there no choice in? What's the given starting point for all knowledge for everyone? And it's perception. There is a starting point, a kind of experience, so to speak. And comparing something to that, bringing it there, is what justifies things. But I think he wants some kind of deduction, some kind of thing. Oh, blah, blah, blah. Therefore, induction is valid. And wrong. You know, we generalize. It's part of how we function. We have concepts. It's part of our consciousness. We perceive. We perceive in a certain way. And so, yeah, we can't use induction to prove induction. We got to take it back to the starting point and observe and see, oh, look, this is what's going on, and it's valid. We can't deduce it or induce it. We just got to say, have this idea of this is valid. And we know from our experience and everything, too. There's a lot of things, if we know how to look, I didn't figure it out on my own. There's a lot of things we can do to show induction is valid. So, quote, that inconsistencies may easily arise in connection with the principle of induction should have been clear from the work of Hume, unquote. Whatever, Hume was wrong, confused, he couldn't figure some things out. That doesn't mean he's right. You know, there is necessity. It just doesn't bonk you on the head, and you can't deduce it. It doesn't come up in your head. You know, they're like, instead of looking for causes and the way things are, as I say, Hume and Popper are a little bit of like Ptolemy, wanting a mechanism on a mechanism, or like looking in the wrong place for things. Some things are not going to be deduced. And, you know, if inconsistencies arise with induction, well then forget your deduction that you're trying to hide behind, because induction makes deduction. You know, if you're not going to get a generalization from facts and experience of particular instances, you have no standard for it. Then you got arbitrary, crazy things. Like, I'll have to put a link to, if I remember, someone who was arguing with Galileo and who said that there have to be 7 planets because there are 7 holes in the head, you know, 2 nostrils, 2 ears, 2 eyes, and a mouth. There are 7 days in a week, 7 blah, blah, blah. So there have to be 7 planets. You know, so there's some kind of like wacko generalization, so-called generalization. Some kind of weird reasoning detached from reality. There's no standard. It's got to be based on reality. Hume's nonsense, the contrary notwithstanding. Because, I mean, it's obvious. Quote, that inconsistencies may easily arise in connection with the principle of induction, unquote. Easily? Inconsistencies? Ignorance? Unknown? You don't know what you're talking about. You need to figure it out. It's hard, yeah. But, what? That inconsistencies may easily arise in connection with the theory of heliocentrism, yeah. Should easily arise from the work of whatever ancient astronomer, but there were questions that had to be answered to prove the theory. That doesn't mean that heliocentrism is wrong. That means it was hard to figure it out. Same thing here. Induction is valid, period. The method of induction, there aren't like inconsistencies and you're looking at the wrong level. You got to start at perception. That's the given, not start it with like, oh, I got these deductions and I want everything to fit that. I want the world to be the way I want it. No. Thinking bows down to reality. Okay, quote, that inconsistencies may easily arise in connection with the principle of induction should have been clear from the work of Hume. Also, that they can be avoided, if at all, only with difficulty. for the principle of induction must be a universal statement in its turn. Thus, if we try to regard its truth as known from experience, then the very same problems which occasioned its introduction will arise all over again. To justify it, we should have to employ inductive inferences, and to justify these, we should have to assume an inductive principle of a higher order, and so on. Thus, the attempt to base the principle of induction on experience breaks down, since it must lead to an infinite regress, unquote. Wrong. Experience is it. And then you can say the same thing with induction. How are we going to justify a deduction? Because some idea. Okay, well, how do we justify that idea? Some idea. Infinite regress. So trying to go to induction is a failure. Perception is it. Experience. You've got to relate it to experience whether you like it or not. It's just a matter of figuring out how. He talks about Kant. And he thinks some things are insurmountable. Okay, but insurmountable and I don't know are different. Just like at one time, heliocentrism was, the difficulties were insurmountable, but people just had to figure them out. Some things are arbitrary and can never be proven because they're arbitrary and false, but some things are correct. It's not insurmountable, it's just difficult. And it's not insurmountable just because someone wants to claim it that way and they can't figure it out. So here are some things he says about induction and the problems he has with trying to figure it out. He talks about people trying to talk about probability for induction instead. Kant, Hume, the fact that he can't figure it out, therefore, it can't be true. But, clearly that's not the case. Quote, the theory to be developed in the following pages stands directly opposed to all attempts to operate with the ideas of inductive logic. It can be described as a theory of deductive method of testing, whereas the view that a hypothesis can only be empirically tested and only after it has been advanced. Unquote. Huh? Why the hell do you want to empirically test it? If you're going to separate yourself from experience, then be consistent. Deductive method of testing? No. You can't be lost in your head. Once you give up on reality and you can't get ideas from experience, your generalizations, well, forget it. If your generalizations aren't generalizations of things in the world, well, forget your deduction. Deduction is parasitic on induction. It is not separate from it. Deduction deals with generalizations and using them in a limited way. So when you deduce, you go from a generalization to a particular or a generalization to something less general or as general. So all humans are mortal. Socrates is a human. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. You're applying a generalization to a particular. Okay, well, how do you know all humans are mortal? Where does that come from? Sorry, Hume, but that comes from experience. Or, let's say, all humans are mammals. Or, let me say, all lightning is electricity. All, make something up. All electric currents through the air produce light. Therefore, all lightning produces light. Something like that. That'd be an example where it's not particular but less general. Deduction is not always to the particular. But so here, so he's talking about his theory, his testing. So we're talking about how deduction is parasitic on induction. So, quote, before I can elaborate this view, which might be called deductivism in contrast to inductivism, I must first make clear the distinction between the psychology of knowledge, which deals with empirical facts, and the logic of knowledge, which is concerned only with logical relations. For the belief in inductive logic is largely due to a confusion of psychological problems with them as to logical ones. It may be worth noting, by the way, that this confusion spells trouble not only for the logic of knowledge, but also for its psychology as well, unquote. But for its psychology as well. Wrong. Yeah. He's the one with the psychological problems in this regard. Logical problems, epistemological problems, confusions. So, besides logical relations, trying to have the idea of logic where you relate ideas to ideas without regard to reality or truth is nonsense. It's meaningless. It is an invalid concept. So the stuff we're seeing here, what he's saying about induction and trying to have truth and all that without generalization and experience, it's epistemological grand larceny. That's what's going on here. We got some stuff he's doing or stuff he's saying about evidence or some concepts he's using here. It's like counterfeit money. You know, he's like trying to counterfeit things. His generalizations are counterfeit if they are not purchased and derived from reality. Generalizations are purchased by effort and work from reality, processed to get things. Just like you want a house, you get the material and you got to process it. You want knowledge, you got to get the material and you got to process it. He wants things without the material and without the processing. Generalizations, all these statements that he can work with without effort, without knowing if they're true and all that, and then he wants to try to manipulate them. Well, once you give up reality, you got no standard. So false does not work. Logical relations, that means relating something to reality, to the evidence of the senses, to experience. If he wants to give up all that, he cannot claim the concept of logic. That is counterfeiting. That is grand larceny. No. And he tries to say that, as I said, and he says here, and I'll put a link to this, you can read some of this yourself. But as I say, it says here that this is an excerpt from The Logic of Scientific Discovery, a book of his that is unfortunate. He should just say, I don't know, instead of writing this nonsense. So, elimination of psychologicalism. Let me see. So he says at one point that developing new ideas or concepts is not logical. There's no logical reconstruction of the process. That just means he doesn't understand it. I mean, there is once you understand it. It's obvious. Because he says here, quote, my view of the matter, for what it is worth, is that there is no such thing as a logical method of having new ideas or logical reconstruction of this process, unquote. Well, then they're not attached to reality. That's what logic is about. If there's no logical method of having new ideas, they're not connected to reality and they're nonsense. I mean, obviously, please. And here he's saying such processes, so some things he's saying are, quote, the concern of empirical psychology, but hardly of logic, unquote. So, again, he's making some mistakes, showing some ignorance, so he's backed into this corner. And then, this last section, quote, according to the view that will be put forward here, the method of critically testing theories and selecting them according to the results of tests always proceeds on the following lines. From a new idea, put up tentatively, and not yet justified in any way, an anticipation, a hypothesis, a theoretical system, or what you will. Conclusions are drawn by means of logical deduction. These conclusions are then compared with one another and with other relevant statements so as to find what logical relations exist between them. Unquote. Nonsense, again. That's not getting what logic is. So, something we're not sure about, anything we can make up, we deduce things from that idea, and we compare them with one another and with relevant statements. You need to compare them to reality and integrate them with other things we know and things like that. Yeah, you kind of compare them, but they need to be connected logically and not just deductively. There's a lot more that goes on. A lot of classification, categorization, essences, comparing measurements of things, the more and the less, all this identity, cause, effect. So here, quote, we may, if we like, distinguish 4 different lines along which the testing of a theory could be carried out. First, there is the logical comparison of the conclusions among themselves, by which the internal consistency of the system is tested. Secondly, there is the investigation of the logical form of the theory with the object of determining whether it has the character of an empirical or scientific theory, or whether it is, for example, tautological. Thirdly, there's the comparison with other theories, blah, blah, blah. And finally, there's the testing of the theory by way of empirical applications of the conclusions from which can be derived from it, unquote. So, connecting to reality is the primary thing. That's what logic is about. And then connecting with other theories is only relevant into how they are connected to reality. So he's kind of, again, counterfeiting, grand larceny, trying to take a theory that was developed step by step from the evidence to the senses and pull it out of its context and take it in his head deductively, kind of like Ptolemaic nonsense. He needs to get into causes. What causes knowledge? What's the nature of things? What's the nature of knowledge? What things make it up? How do we do it? How do we cause truth? Then he'd be better off. But again, he's caught up in this thing. You know, the key, like a chief thing is failing to see that induction is valid, that experience is a standard for things, and that the idea of, and he doesn't get the idea that, and seeing what logic is, he doesn't get the idea that once you go into your head and you deny experience, all bets are off, and you're just dealing with stolen statements, things other people learned by observation and reasoning, observation of and reasoning from reality, all the step-by-step stuff. He's taken that and trying to rip it out of its foundations. He said, quote, "It should be noticed that a positive decision can only temporarily support the theory, for subsequent negative decisions may always overthrow it. So long as a theory withstands detailed and severe tests and is not superseded by another theory in the course of scientific progress, we may say that it has proved its mettle or that it is corroborated. Nothing resembling inductive logic appears in the procedure here outlined," unquote. In other words, nothing connecting it to reality. Hence, invalid. A positive decision can only temporarily support the theory. It can always be overthrown. Oh yeah, so science is about like some kind of cognitive nihilism where fear is a basic thing. And, you know, in nihilism, fear and loathing are like metaphysical emotions. Nothing is a meaning. Everything's uncertain. We go around feeling fear least in some nihilists, fear is immersed in everything you do. It's not just some like temporary emotion like happiness, but fear is like spread out through everything and subverts everything. And so here, it's kind of a similar thing on a different level. You got this cognitive fear. You're never sure. You're always waiting to be shown wrong. And that's like nonsense. No one does that ever. I mean, some people do, obviously, but people have different psychologies and all that. But that's not how science develops. That's not what Galileo did. That's not what Newton did. It's not what Darwin did. So, you know, once he gives up inductive logic and doesn't get what logic is, he's out. So, and what does he say here about some of that? Well, quote, the purpose of this last kind of test is to find out how far the new consequences of the theory, whatever may be new and what it asserts, stands up to the demands of practice, whether raised by purely scientific experiments or by practical technological applications. Here, too, the procedure of testing turns out to be deductive. With the help of other statements, previously accepted, certain singular statements, which we may call predictions, are deduced from the theory, especially predictions that are easily testable or replicable. From among these statements, those are selected which are not derivable from the current theory, and more especially those which the current theory contradicts. Next, we seek a decision as regards these and other derived statements by comparing them with the results of practical application and experiments. If this decision is positive, that is, if the singular conclusions turn out to be acceptable or verified, then the theory has, for the time being, passed its test. We have found a reason to discard it. We have found no reason to discard it. But if the decision is negative, in other words, if the conclusions have been falsified, then their falsification also falsifies the theory from which they were logically deduced, unquote. Maybe. What does it falsify? You don't know. Because nothing has been proven yet. It's all potentially falsifiable. So basically, you know, you got kind of like the idea you're hearing statistics. You can never prove anything. You can just fail to disprove it. That's what he's saying here. Which is a bunch of nonsense. You know? Fail to disprove someone in a criminal court. I think failure to disprove things does not get us to the moon or give us cars or anything like that. So, there is what Popper himself said. Why he's wrong. Straight from the horse's mouth. Nothing made up. That is what he wrote that I read here. And we can listen to his book on Audible, read his book, look at the stuff. We can dig into this and see that the falsifiable stuff is nonsense. So, basically, he's put into this corner because he doesn't understand induction, doesn't really get the role of experience and perception in cognition and thinking, doesn't understand what logic is about and what its function is. And then we get this nonsense like Ptolemaic nonsense. And unfortunately, you know, there are some people who don't know better who read this, who fall for it. But they need to be more like scientific about science. If they did their field the way they accept this without much thought, they'd be laughed out of it or kicked out or failures. Unless it's like everyone's doing Ptolemaic stuff, of course, and you can just make stuff up. But, you know, as I say, the stuff here, Popper is doing the same thing. He says he wants to separate science from pseudoscience, and what does he do? He gives us pseudoscience. It's got to be connected to reality. This is a matter of making things up. He gets himself lost in his own head. So, and this is so opposite to what science is. It is not an option or someone's different point of view. This is wrong. Science is about doing what Galileo and Newton and Darwin, whether you like evolution or not, what Darwin did. It's a rigorous commitment to experience and generalizing from that. I'll go with Newton, not Popper. Newton said, I'll try to put a link to it, physics works by induction, period. So we need to dig into what induction really is if we're going to make progress, be good on this, stop this nonsense, and get people to really understanding what science is so they can do better experiments and all this. You know what induction is, what causes it, what is it made of, what are the atoms of induction, concepts. What's a concept? How do we form a concept? When do we have a valid concept? Does that come up? Invalid concept, does that come up in some of what Marx and Freud are saying? Is that part of the problem? Is it not just, oh, whatever someone says is true and we just got to make stuff up? Yeah, concepts, classification, definitions, induction, sticking to the standard of perception. Those are things we need to do. Then we'll get science better and not deal with this falsification stuff, which is false. We need to figure out how to get the truth of truth. Peace. Or peace, not to the phone.